to the cultural identity of a whole ethnic group, or that has raised such acute ethical concerns and has such potentially global implications in real time through the involvement of a superpower, China. We're very fortunate to have as our speaker Dr. Gül Berna Özcan, who is a reader in international business and entrepreneurship at Royal Holloway University of London. Her early life and education up to master's level took place in Turkey, and she's been based in the UK since the early 1990s. She's had an extremely varied academic career, including appointments in a number of different countries, and I won't try to tell you about all of them. In geographical terms, her research has focused particularly on Turkey and Central Asia. She's interested, among many other things, in the development of entrepreneurship in post-Soviet economies, and in the political alignments of firms and their co-optation by authoritarian regimes. In Batas, we're very fortunate to have had her as a member of our executive council for the last 2 years, where her presence is very much appreciated and she's playing a very dynamic role. She will be speaking for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we shall proceed to the question and answer session. Questions are going to be accepted only in written form, and you can write them in the chat. And please write them in the chat. That's the only place to put them. Address them in general to everyone in the chat so we can all see them. And of course, you can start putting them in as soon as she has started talking, and you can go on putting them in throughout the talk, and indeed during the Q&A session itself as well, in case you're inspired by somebody else's question to ask your own. We do ask that each question should be kept as short as possible, please. Certainly not more than 3 lines in the chat. And each attendee is only allowed to ask 1 question. I think that's all I need to say. And so I have great pleasure in asking Gül Berna, please, to start her presentation.
Thank you very much, Celia, for your nice introduction. Welcome, everybody. I see families and I see a young little girl there. I'm really delighted to see everyone here. Let me say a few things. First of all, I'm really grateful to Batas for organizing this event. It hasn't been easy. We are not used to this form of talking and presenting. And I'm thankful to Kübra Uyghur, who did much work behind the scenes. Last but not least, I have to thank my daughter Ada, who helped me design my slides. So I hope you'll enjoy them. Let me share my visual material with you. Hopefully it will work. Can you see these?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So my talk is on the persecution of Uyghurs and the Chinese Communist Party's digital dungeons. I structured my talk in several parts. I will start with my encounters with Uyghurs in Central Asia. I'm a Central Asia specialist. I'm not a sinologist. Where I come to Xinjiang is through Central Asia. So I would like to talk about this a bit. Then I would like to set the scene in political history, why this is happening, why now, and under what kind of circumstances, and what kind of historical background. And that is a history of colonizing Turkic people in Central Asia, which is an issue that I will touch on between Russia and China, a space that has been transformed and is transforming. The third part, I want to focus on China. What is happening in China, in particular the transformation within the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership of Xi Jinping. In the fourth section, I would like to stress why what is happening in Xinjiang is a cultural genocide, and it is about a racist political control. And I will provide some arguments and evidence. In the fifth section, I want to talk about international responses from countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, other Muslim majority states, from the West, from the UN, from the business community. And we'll talk about implications of those diverse responses. And in the final part, I think I would say it's time for action. And I also would like to stretch my argument on colonizing an imperial order in Central Asia to the present day imperial ambitions, in particular ambitions of China to become a dominant, powerful world leader. On this map, you will see, you are seeing on the top security cameras, which are widely used in Xinjiang, in fact, everywhere in China, as I have traveled there several times. But in Xinjiang, they are there to observe every individual for 24 hours. Beneath that, you see a satellite image. There are many of such images. People like Andrean Zenz and Darren Byler and other scholars have carefully studied these images and came up with convincing and detailed proof of concentration camps and their expansion and their nature. The map below shows the spread of these camps, varying from tier 1 to tier 4, the tier 4 signifying the highest security camps. As you see from the spread, they are everywhere. Now, before I move on to my next slide, I have to put a note here that what I'm presenting here today represent my own views and analyses. They are certainly not the views associated with Roll Holloway or even Batas. So that is a disclaimer I need to make. So how we came here, I would like to set the scene in the political history of Central Asia. This is a colonizing period of Turkic people by the Tsarist Empire, Russia, and Qing dynasty. They are not simultaneous. Russian expansion is varied. It consolidated its power in the later parts of 18th century, specifically, of course, taking control of today's Central Asia. I would like to now describe briefly. When I say Central Asia, I mean today's countries of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. This is a medieval period geography where Turco-Persian cultures lived together. Hence, Tajikistan is a Persian-speaking country. While Russia took control the middle and western parts of the region, Qing dynasty took control of what is today Xinjiang. Both empires actually followed various strategies, but looking at the Russian history evolving into the USSR, there has been a wider and more successful integration of Central Asia into the Russian realm. They both followed settler colonialism in different ways. Benefiting from the Russian Empire, the USSR created a regime. There were many different nations happily together. But deep down, despite its modernizing effort, the USSR was a post-colonial project. It resettled thousands and millions of people in the region. Earlier during the Tsarist period, but more specifically, massive social engineering took place, in particular during the years of Stalin and later by Khrushchev, as they expanded farming through virgin lands projects. So that required a large-scale population movement. Stalin also deported many different ethnic groups, among them Koreans, Volga Germans, Armenians, Kurds, Meskhetian Turks, Tatars from the Crimea to Central Asia, and literally scattered them around. By the time of the independence, Kazakhs were in minority, and hardly any a large size of Kazakh elite spoke their own language. It was thoroughly Russified. It is uneven. Uzbekistan is different because of its long settled agrarian culture. It retained more of its language, but nevertheless, Russian became the dominant language, and the artificiality of these so-called USSR independent autonomous states were only mostly in name in terms of their autonomy. They were controlled from Moscow, but nevertheless, this structure gave a good facade for the USSR around the world to showcase to the other third world countries and developing nations that the USSR was on something great, that it created modernity, it united different peoples. So creating nations within the USSR was a great occupation, as some Central Asians used to ridicule it, that if they saw 3 shepherds on the mountain, they declared them a nation. So that was a process of USSR's global power building. But at the end, from the point of view, we have now self-sustaining, independent states, as this USSR disintegrated. Whereas in the case of Xinjiang and China, there's a different route, that China got its independence and the establishment of Communist Party far later than the USSR. It wanted to preserve its Qing dynasty stronghold in Xinjiang. And in order to protect that position, it repopulated the region. So the both forces, in a way, used mixed strategies of violence. Various massacres took place in Central Asia to impose communism. Certainly a generation of elite and Jadid teachers who promoted new learning and reform in Islamic teaching were all eliminated. And this led to a new political reality. But where we come here today is that Central Asia has now independent states, albeit it's still under the influence of Russia, and this is China's new frontier. And China suddenly faced that it is facing a challenge, especially as its settler colonialism in Xinjiang was never fully successful. Now, while these things were happening, I must say that by and large, this colonization process, either by the USSR, previously by the Tsarist Empire, or Qing dynasty and Communist China, did not get sufficient attention in the leftist scholarship, in particular in Turkey, that because the politics was so much polarized between nationalist, pan-Turkist, and right-wing positions, and the left had to find a defensive position, they often ignored what was happening or what happened in the region. And therefore, even today, there is a high degree of ambiguity. If you look at, for example, Turkish sources, they often don't have really a deeper understanding of the region. Now, I go back to briefly my experience in Central Asia and how I came across Uyghurs. I traveled to Central Asia many times since 2004. And my interest has always been in looking at the business development, entrepreneurship, transition from a communist regime to some sort of market capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, you may call. And during that research endeavor, I came across, as my respondents, numerous Uyghur merchants, traders, business people, and businessmen and women. In 2004, when I first ever encountered an Uyghur merchant, At the time, the region was quite liberal. There had not had any experience of a colored revolution. The climate was very buoyant, welcoming. But surprisingly, I felt all Uyghurs I have spoken to fearful. They were anxious, they were concerned. In later years, this experience repeated itself, only it got worse. In fact, to the extent that they believed that they were closely surveilled by the Communist Party. In a couple of instances, my assistants caused concern. They thought my assistants might be spying on Uyghurs. So there was always this fear of China looming large in their lives and activities, despite the fact that in early decades they were trading with Urumqi and other cities, bringing goods, selling them, taking many risks. Of course, roads were not good. There were various forms of corrupt practices along the way. But the most shocking experience I had was last year, when I went to investigate China's investments, in particular business practices, with a grant I received from the Cannon Institute. And while I was talking to individuals and business people, I came across several Uyghurs who started talking about the hardship their relatives are facing. I did hear about the camps, to be honest with you, but at the time I was not aware of the extensive racial profiling and incarceration that had been taking place in the region. And the more I talked to people, the more I was shocked. And for example, once a trades person, an entrepreneur, she told me that she can't hear any news from her relatives, and no brothers or sisters respond to her calls. And after she learned that this what is going on in the region, she stopped calling them because she was afraid that they might be further prosecuted by this engagement. And at the same time, she told me something very shocking, saying that all male members are in camps, even some female members, and one pregnant relative is under house arrest. And then she told me about the stories of many children being abandoned because they have no parents and being taken away to boarding schools. When I came back, I wrote an article on this because I was so shocked. The more I researched, the more I learned about it, and I wrote this piece for the leftist, progressive Turkish magazine called Birikim, which led many positive responses, and also still leftist groups in Turkey were actually contesting this outcome as a jealousy against China, which I will come back later. So this is the background story. Very quickly, I put across the diverging outcomes of colonizing a region, including Xinjiang, which had Turco-Persian history, followed by, of course, the Mongolian influence, but later shared and contested between two major political systems. Now I have a couple of maps just to get familiar with the complexities of Central Asia. This is the 17th century. Yuri Brigel has a great encyclopedia of maps of the region. And as you see, today's Xinjiang here is still being under the Chagayads, and Astrakhans and Safavids and Khazar Khanate, as well as Jungarians, creating a very different, of course, reality compared to what it is now. We know that around this time, there is a great Mughal Empire, and Safavids also are building very strong imperial influence, and the Ottomans as well. So when we come by the late 18th century, the realities are changing. And in fact, Qing dynasty reaches to the borders of Central Asia much earlier than Russians, albeit their progress stops there, and Russians follow a much more successful campaign from their point of view, success here, to take advantage of this political disintegration, advance their military and industrial power so that they could colonize and turn the region into an agrarian and a militaristic backyard in time. Now, I would like to move on from this imperial legacy to what is happening in China today, which is trying with some success to link itself to this imperial past. I have read many interesting pieces in China Heritage website, and one in particular by Jiang Yingza I came across was fascinating, and she wrote in 5 different sections long essays explaining how China's very ancient imperial system is being retranslated, reshaped by the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. What is interesting about this is that this a practice in Xinjiang about total control and eradication of a culture stems from a regime that is obsessed about control and demands to have one society under one party. This is actually quite interesting because it reminds me Homo Sovieticus that the Stalin and the early Soviet revolutionaries tried to create. And during that period, they of course introduced a huge terror into the society. And in fact, Mao, through his cultural revolution, destroyed millions of lives in the name of creating one society, a one flat society, an egalitarian society, something that is fundamentally different from typical bourgeois society. And this seems to be going on in China in different ways. And there is a degree of subtlety, but there are also banalities. The subtleties, as Jiang Jia explains, this relationship between legalism versus Confucianism in Chinese history, and how legalism takes over in the name of ruling, as opposed to disintegration, fear of disintegration. And the state becomes such an absolute power that whatever state can do then becomes legitimate. And that's how I think we can see what happened in the Cultural Revolution in Mao's period, and how this image is depicting as an overlap of Mao's image to Xi Jinping's repositioning. In fact, as he now a lifetime leader, so he has no limit to his term, we could see very closely how it is being associated much more closely to Mao. And here there is this, going back to legalism dimension, Jiang Jiang quotes a very touching and very disturbing quote of Mao Zedong, who also used old imperial edicts sometimes to defend his decisions. And it goes on saying, I know no law, I hold nothing sacred. And that's more or less, she argues, that is being approached by the Xi Jinping. Now, it is not Xi Jinping, of course, it's also the Chinese Communist Party as a big, monolithic, but diverse. I contradict myself. The party itself is a single totalitarian structure, but it holds together different parts and different regions. And in order to keep the discipline of unity, the party thinks that it can forego numerous freedoms and rights and other societal things. And in the name of doing so, it follows a strict discipline. What is also interesting in this transformation, I want to touch on a couple of things. One is that since the market transition and loosening the communist order, China allowed a degree of private enterprises and relaxed the mobility of capital, allowed foreign firms to come and establish themselves in special economic zones. Deng Xiaoping started this process and it continued. What it happened in this process that China realized that it can buy out loyalties by material return. So in that process, it created a stronger loyalty by rewarding its citizens. But at the same time, that process created huge inequalities between rural areas and urban areas, between different regions within the cities. And that's pretty obvious, and it's getting worse. The China we know today is not really a communist China. It is a form of capitalism under state control. And China knows about this. Chinese Communist Party is aware of that. And in order to compensate this weakness, then they see nationalism as a way of balancing discourse, legitimizing discourse within the society. Hence, we see this discourse of communism with Chinese characteristics. It actually means new nationalism. And the new nationalism is actually on the rise among, in particular, what they call netizens, young people, in public education, in posters, in displays, and ironically, of course, this has very anti-colonial discourse. Both USSR and the Chinese Communist Party always presented themselves as the nations suffered under European colonialism. Indeed, European colonialism was much greater, much bigger. It involved overseas trade, colonies, and shipping millions of slaves from Africa to West Indies, Indian Ocean, and in particular Americas. So there is no comparison, of course. But the fact that while they pursued these overseas colonies and economic interests, I would remind my listeners that China and Russia were also involved in their own forms of colonization, albeit a territorial sense that involved their nearby territories in a contiguous manner. So that's different, albeit globally less important. But as far as Central Asians are concerned, it's extremely powerful and it hurts. So the one episode here that I will finish this slide of arguments is how China came to war on terror. And that's obviously, as everyone familiar with the word, it's the dimension of the Bush administration, US neocon directions towards seeing Islam or Islamists as source of terror, and waging wars in Afghanistan, justifying the invasion of Iraq and else. And Chinese Communist Party, being very flexible and opportunist, jumped on this opportunity. And they declared war on terror, recognizing that Uyghurs are predominantly pious Muslims, and indeed jihadists around the world saw Islam as an anti-colonial opportunity, highly misguided way. Unfortunately, they used various forms of force and were recruiting from everywhere, as people from the UK or France or other places joined these jihadists, young people with the sense of changing the world and doing something new. And similarly, Central Asians were recruited. So Uyghurs were among them, as well as Kyrgyz and other Central Asians, Uzbeks, got into that unfortunately trap. Now, showing this as an excuse, China was able to disquiet the West and suggesting that they are waging a war against Islamist terrorists. Hence, they labeled every Uyghur as a potential terrorist, as a potential radical Islamist. That's how they sell this idea at home and I've been to China several times, and I'm shocked that young people are really worried about terrorism, because they are being spoon-fed every day about these terror and terrorists, while of course they are ignorant about what is going on in true sense in Xinjiang. But at the same time, abroad, it drew recognition and even respect from some quarters. I'll come back to that point later. Sorry. Now, this is the brutal part of the presentation, where I would argue why what is happening in Xinjiang is a cultural genocide. This is not my own argument. It is based on research and analyses done by a number of high-profile scholars, such as Smith-Finley, Joe Smith-Finley from UK, Newcastle University, Darren Byler from US, Washington University, James Leopold from La Trobe University in Australia. They all come up with detailed reports and presented numerous findings and evidence to show that what is going on in Xinjiang is not just simple incarceration of individuals, or it is not like education or re-education as the Chinese state representatives, diplomats lie habitually around the world when they appear on TV channels. And I have a quote, a very recent writing of Mahmoud and Smith-Finley, and I would like to read if you allow me. Since 2012, Xi's Han majoritarian assimilationist state has reconstructed the Uyghur body, mind, language, religion, and culture as a biological and existential threat to the Chinese nation. All Uyghur individuals are now assumed by default to be potentially disloyal subject. By the way, Sean Roberts is another leading scholar. And then, do we have evidence? Plenty. One from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which discovered the China cables, and they issued them both in Mandarin and also translated into English, which creates a database for scholars to look at in terms of instructions, such as show no mercy kind of statements. And here, their own documents reveal that the minimum duration of detention should be 1 year. Now, we have other documents to study, but I will move on. So, what is happening? Extensive surveillance and social control is taking place. Now, I said social control is something the CCP follows in the entire country. So every Chinese citizen, each time they write something in WeChat or go through a street full of security cameras, are being subject to these surveillance machines. But the fact that what is happening in Xinjiang is starkly different, because it takes under the pretext of a new nationalist propaganda in China. Now I'm going to show you a number of things that put together really clearly show that this is a cultural genocide. So in addition to concentration camps, these are not prisons. People are not there because they committed a crime. These are the places they arbitrarily end up. And the camps are heavily protected, and they are being surveilled 24 hours, including toilets. And the eyewitness accounts explain various forms of beatings, torture, and other practices taking place in these camps. But not only camps, these camps are also linked to forced labor. And forced labor either takes place under similar incarceration, producing various goods for Chinese companies, often selling those to these to Western companies, Western brands. I'll show that in a bit. And extensive brainwashing. Now, the brainwashing part, at least Chinese authorities do not deny. They call it re-education. What is the re-education? Well, singing how much they love Xi Jinping, how much they will believe in CCP's supremacy, and how much they will forget about their beliefs and their harmful feelings, harmful thoughts. In fact, Chinese authorities in various leaflets and propaganda material use analogies, sadly, like today's COVID-19, what is happening in these societies as a virus. So they are cleaning out the virus from the brains of these people. Secondly, we see disappearance, systematic disappearance of intellectuals. Either disappear or they end up in prison. Many of them and their whereabouts are not known. Another group of hideous activities are taking place in the form of racial profiling, which I will touch on in a bit. Spying through various spy programs and apps in mobile phones, through which, as Human Rights Watch very clearly documented, through which they invent crimes. Let's say somebody is visiting a website, or they have bought too much gas, or they consume too much electricity. This is considered to be an indication of suspicious activity. So this is a tool to invent crimes. When I first heard about home visits, to be honest with you, I really didn't believe that it could be that far. I mean, it is extraordinary that officials will come and visit households, bring some gifts, and they sleep. They stay with the families. They are uninvited guests, and usually people living in difficult, maybe small houses, difficult circumstances, and especially after men are being incarcerated in concentration camps. Imagine strange men sleeping with you in your house while you go by with your own daily chores. And obviously various forms of abuses are taking place. Strangely, home visits by officials seems to be going on and has been going on for a while. It's not just a new thing. Other ways of destruction takes place in the form of dispersing families, while adults are spread into concentration camps, forced labor, and other means. Children are abandoned. I'll show in the next slide the growing number of boarding schools. And of course, Rahima Mahmoud, in a recent SOAS conference, clearly articulated, she's an Uyghur activist and singer, how women's bodies go through this extensive invasion through forced sterilization, abortions, and other forms of abuse. That's not enough, as if we see the bulldozing cultural sites, artistic heritage, removing monuments, destroying them, destroying the cemeteries. In fact, Aziz El-Kun, who is also a British exiled Uyghur, I should say exiled Uyghur living in Britain, recently in a video conference explained how when he went back, or when he searched online, couldn't find his father's graveyard. And finally, erasing the language, completely making sure that new generation wouldn't know or speak any Uyghur. And here on the right, briefly, I also illustrate from The Economist a visual graph showing how exponentially the security and militarization took place in Xinjiang, in particular starting from 2012 after Xi Jinping came to power, but dramatically from 2016, when the Communist Party chief of Tibet became the chief of Xinjiang and used his merciless tactics. So there is a link between Tibet and Xinjiang here as well. Racial profiling, I want to touch on a little bit on this too, because I think this is a danger facing us in Western societies and all democracies with the spread of artificial intelligence, facial recognition. But what is happening in China is even, of course, beyond, I would say, imagination that we might have here. That is a systematic collection of DNA, fingerprints, iris scans, and blood types, anyone between age 12 and 65. So children are also subject to this racial profiling. So the racial profiling is also used in terms of facial recognition, so that automatically with an AI, authorities, police, whoever is in charge can separate, I guess, Han Chinese from Uyghurs and other Turkic people. Here I have a quote from Human Rights Watch, Sophie Richardson, explaining how extraordinary this form of mandatory data banking of a whole population's biodata, and this is unacceptable in terms of the basic human rights. And underneath, I have an example of SenseTime, who is leading a consortium of 27 companies in China and developing standards for facial recognition. And this company, along with a number of others, now on US sanctions blacklist. So what happens here is the concentration of technological capability at the service of CCP. Forced labor and abandoned children. This is only one slide that I picked from the recent report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, published this year. Many international brands like Nike that produce goods in China are one way or another now using Uyghur workers transferred from Xinjiang. And here it shows a very simple flow of relationship between Hotan and Kashgar, and how Uyghurs, in fact, before 2017, this practice has been going on since 2007, moving people from the region into factories. But more dramatically, within 2 years, about 80,000 Uyghur workers were transferred from Xinjiang to various parts of factories with high security in China. What happens when parents are in jail or in labor camps? Children are abandoned. And in fact, the graph on the right, on my right at least, from The Economist, shows China versus Xinjiang increasing confinement of youngsters, exponential growth, huge growth of floor space of student dormitories in boarding schools, because children are taken away from their families. Either their families are disintegrated in these and disappeared in these digital dungeons or concentration camps, but children are abandoned. So an opportunity for the CCP to re-educate them as loyal, one state, one people principle. Now I would like to move on to responses. Well, I want to present a little bit first from business responses. Here we have Mesut Özil, who was a very popular Arsenal player until he tweeted in support of Uyghurs. Soon after, his club, Arsenal, issued a statement distancing themselves from Özil's position. And soon after, Özil disappeared from major plays. And more so, that year, last year, when Chinese New Year preparations was going on, Arsenal Club, which has now a big fan group and big business in China, removed Mesut Özil's pictures and name from all its souvenirs that appeared in Chinese market. So that's how a club in London behaved as far as human rights is concerned. So they forgo their player. Situation hasn't been very different in the US. The National Basketball Association, NBA, had training camps in Xinjiang when thousands of people were in concentration camps. A number of players that made statements about Hong Kong quickly apologized and reprimanded by NBA. And here there's a cute cartoon I took Kentucky newspaper Herald leader ridiculing these very high-earning basketball players and their stance in terms of human rights. In terms of international official response, there has been no UN resolution, often blocked by China and China's supporters. The most recent attempt by the German ambassador to the UN got the support of 39 countries, marginally better than their attempt before. And most of the signatories were EU member states, including others like Canada, Haiti, Honduras, Australia, New Zealand, no Gulf states, no Central Asian states, not Turkey, no Pakistan, no majority Muslim state was a signatory. On the contrary, China managed to get the support of Cuba and others with a counteroffensive, which challenged the report and called them unfounded allegations levied at China for political purposes. In the US, with the toughening between China and the United States, there has been some progress. It is supported by both Democrats and the Republicans, and Magnitsky sanctions seem to be put in place, and it is actually currently covering several dozens of companies and individuals who are associated with the crimes taking place in Xinjiang. Ironically, Muslim majority countries have been endorsing China. This includes Turkey and Pakistan. In fact, after a brief statement from the Turkish government when China reprimanded Turkey, the President Erdogan visited China and came back with smiles and stated that Muslims are well in China. The situation in Pakistan is even worse. Pakistan is obviously benefiting from Chinese investments and Belt and Road Initiative projects, so it is endorsing every step of China. But Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which had a meeting in 2019, ironically commended China for treating its Muslims well. How hilarious. Other issues about the implications would mean that we have now major implications for democracies, that China is able to create a sphere of influence along with other authoritarian regimes. Now, we can question why it's happening that way. What is the benefit? Perhaps this can be seen in two ways. Number one, their desire to balance West, Europe, and USA in terms of the freedom they have, political freedom, along with financial benefits China would offer. But secondly, deep down, these regimes will gain longevity with China's protection. So that's another reason why this is a self-interested behavior. But with China's behavior in Xinjiang, we see repression and authoritarianism normalized, almost accepted. The UN resolutions I have just recently I talked about, in a way, will give us a clue about what kind of world we are living in and what is happening. Of course, we know that UN has been inconsistent, for example, in terms of the Palestinian issue, that the US blocked those decisions i.e. I'm not demanding or claiming at all that the UN is a non-biased political entity, and many issues up to now has been politicized. And imagine if China does the same thing and what happens as a result. Another danger is China has built now a huge overcapacity in its surveillance technology and exports. It is exporting this technology to authoritarian regimes. When I was in Kyrgyzstan last, in a very naive way of creating smart cities, China actually exported many surveillance cameras to be placed in Bishkek initially. And then there was a revolt and were replaced, as far as I know, I may be wrong, by Russian ones. But after all, there is an ongoing, I guess, attraction of such systems in order to create better social control. And hence, in addition to surveilling Twitter, Facebook, and other accounts with spies and with trolls, many regimes now have other digital possibilities to control their society. And that's really extremely dangerous for democratic opening and for democracies. Digital gulags and dungeons for all minorities, and other fear that at one time in future, a country might decide to punish a group of its citizens, a minority, no matter how we define that minority, in the name of betraying their state or betraying their society. And is there anything that guaranteeing us that similar genocidal attempts will not take place elsewhere? We know that genocide has been taking place in different parts of the world. Rohingya is one example that happened, and China still is one of the regimes supporting Aung San Suu Kyi. But I guess this can happen in other ways and in other forms. And finally, COVID effects on democracies and economies is going to be detrimental, and that is likely to weaken Western democracies and those who really want to see higher standards in human rights. My final point is about time for action. Now, all of us probably can ask the question, so what can we do? What can be done? I listed a number of ways of action and taking an active position here. And that, of course, starts with diplomacy and putting political pressure in all levels, local, national, international, so that there is a constant political pressure on Chinese government about their mistreatment and genocidal attempts on Uyghurs. Another very important area is the way in which Western brands produced in China benefit from various forms of forced and slave labor. And in particular instance, many brands are associated with Xinjiang. A major part of cotton comes from Xinjiang, but also, as I have shown, there is an ongoing forced labor producing goods for many brands, ranging from Nike, Puma, and many others. The report I have mentioned has a detailed list of this. Another forward-looking thing, although Olympics is not about politics, what is happening in Xinjiang is beyond politics, and China should be boycotted, and it should not be allowed to hold Winter Olympics into 2022. Another one that West can do, the British community and scholars can do, is to support and support Uyghur language and culture, but open departments, university departments, establish centers, maybe with public and private partnership. And we all have to educate Chinese, in particular, young, bright Chinese students who come and study in the UK and often have no idea what is going on in their country, or they are being lied about the true fate of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, in the final few minutes, I would like to go back to my opening of the talk, that I see this as a new phase of history of colonialism in Central Asia over the fate of Turkic people, as they are also very different from both Russia and China, in the sense that they have different ethnicity, language, and religion. But at the same time, this is a fluid area, that the frontiers are changing. And I think what China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the growing military and economic presence, both in Asia, Southeast Asia, and putting pressure on Central Asian governments, building roads and various infrastructure projects in order to reach to Europe, open to new ports, indicate a return of the imperial. What we see is not just about the Chinese Communist Party's past during the years that they followed autarkic development policies. It is, on the contrary, a Chinese Communist Party enhanced by communist thought, nationalism and capitalism put together. What happens in this context, whether we will be at the mercy of multinational companies that will prefer to have cheap production in China and ignore the causes and outcomes of their involvement, or there will be a new way of thinking. I think here we could see benefits of multilateralism. Hopefully, if the result of 4th of November elections in the US will be for a new democratic and forward-looking reformist side, and that may be enhanced, because we do need multilateralism also to address numerous global issues. Environment, human rights, and global peace among the most important ones. But at the same time, what we see, this new form of capitalism in China, and the deterioration of production and manufacturing capacity in the US and in the West, as many supply chains are now dependent on China, is a wake-up call to the policies that have been pursued in many parts of the world, but specifically in the UK and the US, towards neoliberalism, reducing the state, dismantling the state capacity, and leaving the space to private actors. That certainly has not worked, and it is not working. In particular, the COVID-19 shows us how much more we need a competent state. It is not about going back to the old forms of state, but definitely we need a new thinking around a developmentalist and welfare-focused capitalism in the West. I guess others would prefer to see socialism. That's a matter of a different debate. Sorry. So thank you very much for your patience. I will stop here and will happy to have your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gül Berna. That was a real tour de force. I mean, you gave us the historical background, the comparison with Russia, the actual bad things that are being done to the Uyghurs nowadays, and the response or non-response of the outside world, the role of liberal capitalism in that. So you've given us so much to think about, and also I'm sure inspired us to try to think what we might be able to do ourselves to stop this dreadful persecution. So let us proceed to questions, if that's all right with you. Kubra has very kindly helped by bunching the questions together where there have been several on the same topic. A moment. Yeah, right. Have you or anyone else in the audience faced any pressure from their university not to speak out against China?
I have not, because I have not spoken against China as such. I don't consider that what I'm doing is against China. No, I haven't.
Thank you. Why are other nations, notably Turkey, not speaking out against the PRC and not intervening?
Excellent question. I would like to talk about Turkey. The President Erdogan recently picked a fight with Macron, the French president, but he hasn't shown the similar rigor and fire about the Uyghurs. In fact, as I said, after visiting China, he was pretty pleased. Well, as we speak, Turkey has incarcerated all major Kurdish MPs and politicians. It basically appointed unelected people to the positions of municipalities to replace elected ones. Many journalists, academics, anyone who spoke against the government are now subject to courts and imprisonment sentences. I guess what I would see, this authoritarianism, the tendency from democracy to single man rule in Turkey, would like to keep a China card open as a perhaps a balance against the West. Certainly, I see President's behavior highly inconsistent with his own religious and ideological stance.
Right, thank you. I've lost my list now. That's it, there we are. Could the fact that multinational enterprises headquartered in China and their economic dependence on these facilities be a reason for such a reserved approach on the part of many countries?
Yes.
Multinational enterprises is written here with capitals, but I think it probably just means any multinational enterprises.
Multinational enterprises, almost all major brands, like Foxconn, Taiwanese firm, Apple is producing in China. China has become the factory of the world. Even emerging market firms, like Turkish firms, have been attracted by China's market size. So there are two things. One, producing in China and selling in China, which is a huge financial, of course, benefit to these large brands, major brands, but also producing cheaply in China. And for a long time, they served their interests while abandoning, of course, their traditional home markets and taking advantage of these relatively cheap production sites. And they are not interested in changing their position, as I have illustrated, like Arsenal, like NBA, and they see issues as purely money-based. But that attitude may change. I think the issue of decoupling, the US sanctions against China, and perhaps with the COVID, Western rethinking about dependence on China may lead to reconfiguration on supply chains, and that is likely to happen. It is maybe happening also slowly, that we need shorter supply chains, we need safer supply chains, and we have to be more risk averse as far as an unpredictable authoritarian system is concerned.
Thank you. The next question, you mentioned that the Uyghurs are all devout Muslims, or this may have been perhaps, I'm not quite sure whether that was your characterization of them or the Chinese view of them. So my question, this is my question, is what role does extermination of religious belief and practice play in the re-education that these people are made to undergo, and how is it carried out?
as far as I read and followed, they are asked to forget about this belief system, because Chinese Communist Party, although has very good relations with the Gulf states, repeatedly propagated the view that the country has no religion and people should not dogmatically follow religious beliefs. Now, we don't know what happens afterwards. Darren Byler spoke to a number of camp survivors about their psychological torture and what they went through. And many come out, of course, with huge damage, psychologically damaged. And I guess we need to research, and I'm not able to answer this properly, what these people went through and how they will survive their lives, whether they will carry various forms of traumatized behaviors, maybe some mental illnesses, whether they become even more religious. I can't, of course, prejudge these things. It requires further research.
Thank you. With accusations of Islamophobia increasingly directed against the West, will China continue to escape criticism for its treatment of the Uyghurs? I mean, this is a bit repetitious, but I imagine we're looking really here at double standards, aren't we?
No, it is a good question. Certainly the issue, the radicalization in Islam is a problem. It is an ongoing issue. It is not resolved. And the clever thing Chinese Communist Party does, it does a direct linear relationship between this fear of radicalization and the tension in Europe and what is going on in a pious society. They use this as a pretext. But I'm afraid what is happening in France certainly is helping to those who see Islam as a threat to their society. In fact, when I was visiting Beijing a couple of years ago, I gave a talk, and then I was invited for a meeting by a number of Chinese scholars. And one of the first things they asked me and said, "Oh, we read that Islam will take over Europe. What do you think about that?" And that is their misinformation, but also, I guess, a way of communicating their common ground with those who obviously are disturbed by radicalization in Europe. So yes, I think China will use this all the time and everywhere as much as possible.
Thank you. Are there other minorities in China that could end up being targeted in the same way as the Uyghurs?
I apologize. I should have mentioned other Turkic people, Kyrgyz and Kazakh, smaller in proportion the region's population, but they also had been taken to concentration camps and treated badly as others. But in the Chinese discourse, Uyghurs are more as an identified internal enemy. People have to be re-engineered, almost rebooted. Apologies for the terrible word, but almost in that way being depicted. Now, China has other Muslims. I interviewed, for example, many times Dungans who escaped China. They are Han Chinese Muslims. Many live in Central Asia as well. But as far as we know, for example, they haven't been subject to a similar treatment. That's why I call this a racial genocidal attempt.
Thank you. Have governments spoken of any sort of economic sanctions or other forms of diplomatic pressure on China?
As far as I know, not really. I mean, British government has talked about various ways, and perhaps the way in which Huawei's bid for 5G being blocked to a certain extent is an outcome of that. And I personally appreciated that at the final stage, they were able to change their position. But there is really not a strong, all-out, consistent way of putting economic pressure on China. China's growth is a West-driven thing. If the West did not create these opportunities for its MNEs, multinational firms, producing goods and services in China, Chinese economic success through these special economic zones would have never been a reality. So US has more leverage, and we will see what happens after next week.
Thank you. Now this question is a little bit repetitious, but we could probably make it slightly different. The question is, are non-Uyghur minorities in Xinjiang province treated differently from Uyghurs? But could we consider not only non-Uyghur minorities, but also non-Muslim minorities?
Well, I guess here we are not talking about a minority, but another majority group. Almost half of the population are Han Chinese. And initially they were moved there as part of militarization of that zone against the USSR. So obviously they have the upper hand, because for a long time people in Xinjiang were marginalized in terms of their bureaucratic position, attainment in education, in income. They were marginalized to the extent that they became only the rural people that sustained agriculture. And in fact, in urban China, Uyghurs are considered to be nice people, agrarian, backward, with good food. And that's the ignorant mainstream Chinese view.
So you mean the majority of the Chinese population have a positive view of the Uyghurs?
That I don't know. Mine is anecdotal view. I don't know. We cannot carry out independent public surveys in China. Yeah. That's why Chinese Communist Party has a full social control over the practices of individuals. So it is resting on this deep-seated social control. I would say majority of Western Chinese people don't necessarily have much information about what is going on, or they just believe that what the government is doing is right for them, because there is a total control over media, there is total control over social networks and digital sphere. There are no alternative views presented in China proper. Therefore, it will be probably wrong to make assumptions about what people know and how they know it. My guess is those who are more West-oriented, for example, we have thousands of Chinese students studying in the UK. They must be checking BBC, they must be looking at British press. It would be fantastic if we could do a survey how they see it themselves. Anecdotally, I heard from a couple of people saying that those students were very embarrassed to see those things because they didn't know what was going on. I believe that there are many young, bright, well-intended Chinese students who really don't know what is going on in Xinjiang. And of course, there are also those who are brainwashed. That's another trend that I observe among scholars working on China. They emphasize there's a young, much more aggressive netizens, those who use social media, and they are very aggressive. In fact, when Mesut Özal talked about Uyghurs, his young fans immediately abandoned his fan site. They put very aggressive comments, and his name and his role was completely removed from computer games and everything. So there was also an orchestrated backlash. So that's how social control actually works when you have a one-party state, that the millions of people with one click of order may behave in the way in which the party wants. So I have to say that there are two situations here, and maybe the more aggressive nationalism is more dominant and more widespread, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now this is quite a different question. What has been the impact on Uyghur culture in terms of it and their literature being wiped from books and records?
Would you repeat again, please?
Yes, I'm not quite sure what sort of books and records are meant. What has been the impact on the Uyghurs' culture in terms of it and the Uyghurs' literature being wiped from books and records?
Well, the research by Joe Smith Findley shows that textbooks are completely redone. And not only it is about erasing the language, but it also about erasing people's history. So she looks at school books and explains this in detail. I guess that's as much as I could say, that that is a total re-engineering of education.
Yes. Thank you. Now, this is quite a long one. Owing to the People's Republic of China's recent election to the UN Human Rights Council, it is likely that the issue of Uyghur Muslims is going to stay in the grave. This would render the credibility and accountability of the Council very futile. What steps does the international community need to undertake to prevent the UNHRC becoming a sheer propaganda tool?
A great question and a great concern as well. Not only China, of course, Saudi Arabia and Russia. So, you know, it's extremely difficult. I think the difficulty here is the appeal of China for other authoritarian states, so that China can actually bring those states together for its own cause. But I'd like to say that China's prestige comes from its economic power, and that economic power is directly related to the US and Europe. China sees Central Asia as a gateway to Europe. China sees its expansion and its posturing in relation to the West. If West acts consistently and together, that will reduce China's glamour.
Yes, thank you. Now here is again a rather different one. Are there any Chinese scholars conducting research about Uyghurs in China? It would be interesting to read their critical analysis of this issue, or is this topic fully abolished at Chinese universities?
Climate in China is very, very tough. I should have, but I didn't talk about how Xi Jinping's era came with many purges for intellectuals in China as well. So the opponents, those who have different ideas, have been sidelined and punished. Therefore, there is a much tighter control over academia. And there is very, very limited room for Chinese scholars to say anything against the party.
Yes, that's very understandable. Thank you. So I think this is going to be the final question. Do you see the persecution of Uyghurs as a strategic mistake for China, especially as the channel for Chinese expansion and the Belt and Road Initiative is primarily through the countries with a Turkish or Turkic majority?
Yes, very good question. Yes, it is actually a source of anger in Central Asia. When I was there last spring, both in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I saw a huge rise of anti-China feelings. As the camps illustrated an ugly face of China, but also Chinese investments in that region only benefit the top ruling strata, and they do not touch on the livelihoods of people. Chinese firms bring their own workforce. They often have supplies from China, not from the local firms. Just the opposite of what they did through special economic zones, because they put rules for Western firms to have large domestic component. But in Central Asia, they take advantage of lack of rules, corruption, and other practices, loose practices. So yes, I think camps was a wake-up call for Central Asian people, but not the leaders. I think by and large, Central Asian leaders have been quite careful not to speak against China because they see China as an alternative source of finance and investment. And that is a way to sustain their regime, because China doesn't want to impose anything. For China, peaceful coexistence means having deals behind the doors, state to state, between them and these leaders. They don't care about the rest. So despite the fact that they claim that they don't interfere in the affairs of other countries, by the fact that they are dealing their business like this, they are interfering. They basically extend the lives of these authoritarian systems.
Yes, thank you. There's just one more question, if you can bear it. I mean, we've only got 5 minutes left now. And you did touch on this actually earlier. Could you provide any insights about a comparison between the Dungan minority in Central Asia, their corresponding Hui minority in China, versus the Uyghur, as for differences in their socio-economic situation?
Well, Dungans, Hui, in China are quite numerous. I think by China's size, they are tiny. These relatively isolated communities, but they do exist in big cities, such as in Beijing. You can see halal restaurants run by them. But in Central Asia, the communities of Uyghur and Dungan are definitely apart. In fact, I did a survey in 2009 because I was interested in different Muslim communities' engagement in business doing and entrepreneurship. And there I found that they were very different, that they did not intermix. And every religious group, same for Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uyghur, Dungan, those were the groups I looked at, and Uzbek. What I observed was very interesting, that they lived their religious practices and business within their community without having an overarching communal space with one another. There was not conflict, but certainly not an intention or desire for cohabitation.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Gül Berna. I mean, you've answered these questions in such a masterful way. You weren't stumped by any of them. You were able to deal with the, all these different ramifications with the economics and the global politics. I think it's a most impressive performance. Thank you very much indeed. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. And if any of you are interested in pursuing BATAS, we're always very keen to have new members. And I can tell you that our next webinar is going to be on the 27th of November, and it's going to be, it's particularly timed to follow the American election, and it's looking at Turkey's relations with the West, both with the US and with Europe. So I hope we shall see you again. Thank you all for coming.